You're listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. And today on the program, I have Kim Alexandre. She is the Vice President of Sales and Ad Ops at Pioneer Podcast Network. Super excited to have her join me today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Heather. Excited to be here.
So, Kim, I'm really curious kind of how you made your way into podcasting. I know you mentioned you've been a podcast listener for a long time, but you're relatively new to the podcast space. Is that the case?
Yes, I've been in the podcast space for a year, a listener for more, but actually in the business side of things for a year. I have been in audio since I graduated college, and I'm not going to say when because I don't want to date myself, but it's been a long time. And I've also spent about a decade working for a sales consulting firm, helping develop talent into performance and revenue. So had a lot of sales experience, a lot of audio experience. And after working in radio, I actually got a text from the CEO of Pioneer Podcasting Network. And it was a former colleague of mine that I worked with in radio. And he was like, "Hey, is this still Kim Alexandre?" And I was like, "Yes, of course. Hi, Bert. It's me." And we started chatting. And he said, "Hey, we're ready to take our network to the next level. And I just remember you from sales at the radio station. And you were awesome. And I'd really love to talk to you about it." And that was all it took. A few weeks later, here I am at Pioneer.
That's awesome. So your background is really in more of the terrestrial audio space, or have you been in audio streaming, or both?
Terrestrial audio for the most part, but I also did sell digital solutions, and streaming services were part of that, depending on the various platforms and such. So I've had experience in a lot of digital in addition to terrestrial audio. And in my consulting days, I had consulted every form of media sales organization that you could think of, from television to digital to marketing services to radio, obviously, and streaming was part of that too.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm curious now that you've kind of been able to get a sense of podcasting and how podcasting works, what would you say are maybe some of the biggest differences that you've seen between the other forms of audio and podcasts in particular?
The ability to create attribution and to really be able to identify from an advertiser's perspective what those KPIs are and to match them up with the tools and resources that we have so that we can really show the evidence and the proof of the performance of a podcast campaign. And there are services out there in the terrestrial media space and radio that can do similar things. But with respect to podcasting being a digital centric platform, it's a lot easier to prove performance that way.
So I find that so fascinating. And I'm really glad you brought that up because in my prior career, I worked in radio at the beginning of my career in radio ad sales. And then I moved to newspaper and other things. But I was really in just like traditional mass media where there was no way to prove any sort of attribution. I mean, really, what proved success was how many people came in and said they heard your ad and
Yep.
actually purchased something. And so then when I got into the podcasting space, granted, of course, between my time in traditional media and the podcast days, there was the digital revolution, which, with digital advertising, there's just so many metrics that go along with it and so much rich data that, the marketers and advertisers really love to consume. Really to kind of prove what they're doing is actually working. But, obviously there are billions of dollars that are being spent in these traditional mass media formats where attribution really isn't a part of it. And moving into podcasting, so many advertisers would ask things like, well, you have to prove to me like who's listening. You have to prove to me how this is working. And, sometimes I would just scratch my head and think, yeah, but you're spending so much with these other platforms that don't have any ability to track any of that. So it's so great to hear you say that podcasting really is such a step above those other forms of advertising, because I think that sometimes in the podcast space, we have a tendency of maybe, I don't want to say getting down on ourselves, but like there's kind of this overarching, like, oh, well, we can't really prove what's happening. And so it sounds like you've had a really different experience. I'm curious if you can tell us about that.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that I've always loved about podcasts in general is that intimate connection between the host and the listener. So, and then the drive behind spoken word and what kind of engagement that creates. So, taking that concept of really talented hosts, really great content, and really good shows, and creating that intimate connection between the advertiser and the listener. So, aside from attribution tools, like, you can have a tech stack that has a plethora of tools to help you provide data, but there's also other things that you can do to help prove success. So, when we're onboarding a new advertiser, one, it has to be the right fit. We talk
Mhm.
about that a lot in podcasting, but what I found sometimes as, if you're working with an exchange as a publisher, we're working with exchanges, there's not a lot of interaction. It's very transactional. So learning really about what the advertiser's goals are and what the brand's goals are aren't always part of that conversation. It's how many downloads do you have? What's your CPM? And do you have a host that would like this? So we really take more of a boutique approach to it and a hands-on approach to matching the right host with the brand to start with. And if we have that fit, we do a deep, deep discovery conversation with the brand to make sure that we really understand what the campaign goals are. Take away the fact that it's a podcast platform, take away the fact that it's audio. What are those goals? And digging really deep. And then identifying once we figure that out with, in partnership with the brand, what the 2 to 3, maybe even 4 measures of success look like specific to those goals.
Mhm.
And then when we learn that, we look into our toolbox and see what we have to help us deliver on those measures of success. And if we can, great. And we're very transparent all along the way. There are times that we've had to say no because I didn't feel we could meet the objectives, but lots of times we can say yes. So once after evaluating the toolbox and knowing that, okay, I can reach these measures of success, we then have an introductory conversation between the host and the brand, the stakeholder, primary stakeholder of the brand, to make sure that there's synergy there still. And I think it's important for hosts to really understand from the brand's perspective the story that they want help telling through
Mhm.
the host. And those conversations have proven really, really valuable with our advertisers. Ultimately, the goal is to renew. So that's why we're striving for success. And so we're very diligent about taking those steps along the way. And some of the creative things that we've done to help with some measures of success, especially with branding campaigns, those are some of the hardest to measure, even with all of the great attribution tools that
Mhm.
podcasting platforms or host providers do have. We use some of our own to help establish that. We have a very large database of email from our listeners. So sometimes we utilize our email database to create brand lift surveys and studies to see if before and after a campaign, what kind of lift we have from the listeners themselves. We often provide incentives because people don't really like filling out surveys. But when it's coming from their favorite podcast or their favorite host, we find that the listeners are a little bit more excited to engage. Some of the other things that we do in the partnering and contracting side is early on, very transparent. We are, because of our digital expertise as well, getting read only access into Google Analytics helps us see if we're creating lift in other areas aside from, say, a promo code or a landing page, which are great to help measure success, but that's not every advertiser's goal.
Mhm.
So doing things like getting access to Google Analytics has been a huge help. And then we also create benchmarks on social media. So for the extension campaigns we do on social with some of our hosts, we can we can see where there's lift in engagement and follows and likes, not on our hosts' accounts, but on the brand account. And we've been able to show success there too. So it's just thinking of other ways that you can utilize all the resources that you have as a creator, podcast creator, and leverage that to help showcase results for the advertiser. And it's important to have conversations all along the way. I sometimes, advertisers, you might get a campaign and set it and forget it because that's what's great about, a host platform, but it's really important to keep the conversation going throughout the campaign because maybe an initiative might change or we just shifted a creative strategy with one of our clients because they realized they wanted to do more around the holidays for a certain brand. So those conversations are important. Being transparent has worked very, very well for us, and being honest and that trusted resource for the brand. It's hard to get that kind of partnership when you're working through an agency or an exchange. So those relationships really come from the brands that we work direct with. And we have a significant number of those. So building those relationships and partnerships, trust, value, all of that all along the way has been definitely a predecessor to the success and the
Yeah.
renewal.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So tell us a little bit before we get too deep into the conversation. Tell us a little bit about Pioneer and exactly what your company does.
Yeah, so Pioneer Podcasting Network, we're small, intimate network, not no goals to be the iHearts or Spotify's of the world, but we do treasure really awesome content. It's a content first approach network. And the CEO of our network, Bert Weiss, is also a veteran morning show radio host, syndicated in 27 markets, top rated show in the Atlanta metro area, has a lot of expertise on content and delivery. So he's publishing a book in March called Listenable, and it's really to focus on helping creators be more listenable. Our
Mhm.
tagline is give your voice a bigger voice. And that comes with a content first approach. And it's a very small team. On the sales side, there's just two of us, but that's by design so that we can keep that interaction, that one on one approach with our clients. And then also, our talent is committed to our clients as well. So it's a holistic environment that I treasure because I know it doesn't really exist in a whole lot of places. And it's been a really great opportunity to stand out that way. I mean, we have downloads that definitely yields, larger ad buys. So we have that luxury, and being based in a metro market, I say, the Burt Show podcast is our flagship podcast anchored here in Atlanta. So it does give us some opportunity to do things a little differently.
Mhm. So it sounds like you really are content creators first, and then really you're there to help support advertisers and connect the podcast with the advertiser. Is that the case? Do you produce all of the shows that are the shows that you guys are selling ads on?
We don't produce all of them, but we do produce a handful. So I should say a handful. There's three shows in particular that are all, I would call them spinoffs of the Burt Show. And Burt says this all the time. He's like, we love to keep it in the family and help talent grow and prosper. So one of the goals that we have, so there are some podcasts in the network that we're not actively selling right now because the growth needs, but that's one of the parts that we love is watching talent grow and watching their podcasts grow. We do offer marketing support for podcasts. Cassie Young is our EVP of digital. We call it her secret sauce. She's so good at marketing. And that's part of the services that we do provide the podcasts that are in our network, so that we've got some skin in the game and helping them grow their audiences as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Very, very cool. So, in terms of podcast advertising, can you tell us a little bit? I know you've talked about this connection between the host and the product, understanding the brand's goals. All of those things, of course, are really important. But is there anything that stands out to you as being really pivotal in terms of constructing a really solid ad campaign for podcasts?
Yes, I do feel share of voice is a huge factor. So if you look at, I know we talked a little bit about terrestrial radio. If you look at the spot loads, it could be 9, 10 commercials in a break. It's very difficult for a listener to remain engaged. So one of the things that we're very consistent with is our units and how many ads we have in a podcast. So depending on the length of a podcast, we may only have a pre-roll opportunity. Longer podcasts will have pre-roll and mid-roll. But even in those cases, we only have roughly 5 to 7 ads in any given podcast. So it ensures that the share of voice amongst all ads is still significant, but then also honoring exclusivity to advertisers that are doing host reads. Because from, again, looking at it content first, is you have multiple hosts endorsing brands in one category in one episode, it doesn't sound very good. And the legitimacy of that trust and intimacy between the brand, listener, and host is diluted. So that share of voice is something that I found is a big driver in success. And I actually was listening to a podcast about spot loads, and I heard advice to podcasters to add more units, add more units. I was like, no, I wanted to jump through the screen and stop the conversation because I think that's detrimental to the success that we're starting to see. And the data shows that podcast advertising generates greater results in many cases. And that listeners, I think the last number I saw was maybe 72 or 71% of listeners trust podcast ads more than any other platform. And I'm committed to keeping that, to maintaining that status and protecting share of voice for our brands.
I think that that is so key. And I had Gabriel from Edison Research on the show not long ago, and we were talking about the fact that for the first time, really ever in podcasts, listeners are starting to say that they feel like the ad load is more than they want. And it's such a fine line because I think for so many years podcasts really weren't monetized with advertising the way I think they could be. Now, granted, I have certainly had conversations with, some of the OGs in the podcast space that are like, hey, podcasts were created to be ad free. Like, we were trying to get away from this in terrestrial radio, and that's why we started podcasting. I totally get that. But I also feel like, there are people who listen to podcasts that you can reach on podcasts that you can't reach with any other marketing messages because they really are unreachable. They're not consuming other forms of content. And so I do think that as an industry, having advertising be part of the way that we're monetizing is really significant. But it's also really important that we do protect the integrity of the medium. And I really would hate for us to get to a place where we are in those terrestrial radio spaces of ad loads where it's just like, oh my gosh, here comes the ad break. Like, I need to go listen to something else, or I have to fast forward through them. Part of the reason that podcast ads are so successful right now is because people actually listen to the ads, right? And I think that that's like sometimes when I'm thinking about advertising and just as, a consumer myself, I think, well, this ad is never going to be effective if people aren't actually hearing it. And so that is the key with all of it, right? Is somebody actually listening to your ad. And the problem with ad loads that are too high is that it fatigues the listener and they want to fast forward and they can fast forward. Do you have any theories about how many ads should be stacked together when you do like mid-roll ads, for instance? Is there a minimum number that, or should say a maximum number of ads that you guys will place back to back?
So right now, and this also goes back to the host. So on one of our shows, we have a handful of hosts. So there's a lot of opportunity for different voices in an ad break. And so in cases like that, if there's two pre-roll, three mid-roll, I feel the fatigue is minimal because you've got different voices, different messages, different brands, and there's distinct differences between that. However, if we had shows that only had one host, for example, I would argue that maybe it's one pre-roll or two pre-rolls and then maybe just one mid-roll or maybe some ad markers that are strategically placed out over the time frame of the podcast, but not to put back to back ad placements if you're just a single host. The bad listener experience and yeah, the chance of fast forwarding is probably higher.
Yeah, for sure. So, do you guys do dynamic ad insertion?
We do. So one of our podcasts is repurposed. So to do baked in, it doesn't really go, it doesn't, you can't do it. So in those cases, we're just dynamically inserting ads. We do have a podcast where we've done some baked in ads as well. And that's another area where when you've got baked in ads, trying to measure success has to be done differently than just downloads or estimated impressions. There are lots of other factors that can go into that. So we do both
Mhm.
ad placements.
Great. I feel like you had mentioned a little earlier that you guys really are seeing more brand advertisers enter this space. I'm curious from your experience, what percentage of the advertisers you're dealing with are direct response as opposed to those brand conversations or brand advertisers?
Right now it's around 50-50. So we have the direct response brands and branding brands running at the same time. Yeah, it's about 50-50.
That's great. And I think it's so important as we hopefully get more brand advertisers in this space that we realize that brand advertisers do have different goals than direct response advertisers. I think that direct response advertisers are great because they prompt the person to buy, where brand advertisers kind of create the awareness that they can buy. So I do think that obviously they go hand in hand. And just because a company is doing a direct response campaign doesn't mean they're not doing brand advertising at the same time, right? They're creating awareness for their company, and that's important. But I think that, the advantages of direct response advertisers is that, it's essentially an equation. They know if they invest X number of dollars, they're going to get X number of dollars back. They have it dialed in, they know what success looks like. And they're very critical and very, they analyze their campaigns, scrutinize their campaigns to a high degree. Of course, brand advertisers are going to scrutinize campaigns as well, but the goals are different with brand advertisers. I'm curious from your experience, what have you seen the differences be between the two? What stands out as kind of just defining factors of each?
The biggest differentiator is the creative.
Mm,
It's the storytelling piece, or identifying benefits of certain products or features and services. So when it comes to the creative, and I do feel that's such an important factor in the success of any campaign. And in my own podcast listening, realize that I feel that the industry is somewhat lacking in creating really good audio content in some places. So working with really solid talent is the start, but it's also the script and the talking points as well. So when it comes to direct to consumer DDC, it's, what's the hook, what's the value, what's the promo code, or, and what does the host love most about it? But when it comes to the branding campaigns, it's the storytelling and it's the engagement between the brand and the host. And with branding campaigns, we always recommend that the brand take advantage of social extensions so that they can carry the message, the storytelling, the story of the brand itself, and then carry it to social media so that you get the audio storytelling and then some visual video storytelling components with the same host to help really emphasize the brand story that they're trying to share.
great. I love that. And I'm curious because you've mentioned it a couple of times. What role do you feel those extensions play in an overall campaign? So, obviously, we have podcasts as the center pillar in what it is that we're creating, but social, newsletter, website, potentially YouTube, those can all be really contributors to create a more global kind of 360 campaign that is, hitting a listener in multiple places. What kind of has been your strategy or tactic to expand beyond just the podcast?
So the podcast has some have YouTube channels. So
Mhm.
utilizing that space to incorporate video, utilizing the individual hosts' social accounts, and we get permission and they buy in. Whenever we do an organic social campaign, it's always at the host discretion because we want to make sure that it stays very, very relevant and very close to their personality as well. But those platforms it creates additional reach for the advertiser, and you're still able to capitalize on the host brand that you're working with at the same time. So it helps just bring those stories to life, whether it be Facebook, and every host is different, but the podcast itself should utilize their channels, but then also think about the platforms that the hosts are on and what they're comfortable sharing on, and obviously following all the rules with respect to identifying what's an ad and what's not, which I think we've heard the podcasts landscape, the wild, wild west for a long time. And one of the areas that we were clued into just from our terrestrial radio experience is that, payola plugole it's not allowed anymore, but it was happening in podcasting. So to help offset that, we created a new ad unit called a podvertorial, which is really just a segmented sponsored podcast hosted by one of our hosts in like an interview style. And we drop it on our feed. We brand it, the client's brand, et cetera. So it's thinking creatively too about other ways that we can help achieve those goals. And that's a great opportunity for an education and brand awareness as well. But the social extensions have proven to be very valuable, and it creates a more intimate experience between the brand and the host. and quite frankly, a greater chance of renewals.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you and I both obviously have been in audio for a really long time. Love audio for so many reasons. I do think one of the challenging factors of audio that we're never really going to, well, I shouldn't say never, but that is hard is that when you are on social media and something looks interesting, you can click, right? Like if you're in a newsletter and something looks interesting, you can click. There is this immediacy that happens with things that are more tangible than audio has. I'm very excited, and it's possibility by the time this interview plays that there will be technology that does this, because I know I've been talking to a company that, is working on the idea of, hey, this ad is playing and oh, by the way, it's on your phone right now. You can go and click on it right this minute. And I really hope that that actually comes to fruition soon, because there can be a bit of a disconnect. And it's not that the audience is disconnected from the brand. It's that the way I look at it is you're listening to an ad, you think, I'm really interested in this product or service, but you're doing something else, right? Like most people don't just sit in one spot and listen to a podcast. You're doing another activity. And so while you maybe hear about it and you're interested in the product, remembering to go to the site, and then on top of that, remembering to go to a landing page, remembering to go use a promo code. All of those are just kind of areas where it's not that podcasts haven't been effective, it's that it's harder to track that result. And I get frustrated a lot of times because, especially when I hear an advertiser advertise, let's say a lot in podcasting, but then I also see them on Instagram a lot, which is kind of where I hang out when I'm not listening to podcasts. And it's like, oh, okay, well, now I'm going to look at pros and I'm going to say, oh, let's click on that and let's see what it has to offer. And it's not just because of the ad that I saw on Instagram. And truthfully, it's not just because of the podcast ad either, right? It's this marketing mix that has led me to be more interested in their product and to click through. What I hate is knowing that Instagram is getting the credit where podcasts are not. So it sounds like what you really are saying is just maybe a higher level of effectiveness for the overall campaign and maybe a level of trackability throwing in those other elements.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would love for that technology as well. I think it was a program director that I worked with in radio, like that, gosh, 25 years ago. And he refused to let my staff add promo codes or anything like that in a commercial or, mention me and you'll get 25% off. He's like, people don't remember. And it's true. Those micro moments, if we can capture them as they're happening within podcasts, it would be a game changer.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, we'll have to keep our fingers crossed that that
Yes.
happens. What mistakes do you see advertisers making in podcasting?
Oh, creating landing pages with difficult URLs. So a URL could look really great on paper and on a screen, but when the host is saying the URL, it might not always come across. And we did have an advertiser that happened to early on. So it's one of the first things in a conversation when we start to build out a campaign and execute, that I share that story all the time. I won't say the advertiser name, but it's that part's really important. So if you are going to create a unique destination, please make sure that it sounds as good on air as it looks on paper. Don't get too,
QP.
creative or kitschy. Yeah, don't. It's not worth it for the amount of potential consumers that you will lose or disengage. That would be, I would say, the biggest mistake that I've seen. And then also not choosing the right host. There's a level of professionalism in the podcast space, and then there's some that aren't. And I remember listening to one podcast, and it was for a windshield wipers, and the talent, they were giggling through their read, and I was like, "Gosh, that's one, it's unprofessional, but it's not good for the brand either." So that integrity, making sure that your podcast host has the experience, has the knowledge, has the talent to deliver really good creative on your behalf. That's probably the second biggest challenge or mistake that I see some brands have in what they choose. The last mistake is not opening yourself up to a conversation with your publisher. People like me or my coworker Jared, where we're experts in our field and we're dedicated and we're passionate. if in podcasting and if you churn your advertiser base, it's just so much more difficult to develop business. So our goal is to always create results and always create success. And the best way to do that is to partner and contract along the way. And I do wish more advertisers would be open to that instead of kind of putting themselves behind a walled garden sometimes, because there's a lot of creativity out there. And if you open up your mind and allow some other people to help you develop it, you never know what kind of great results you'll have.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So I just want to touch on each of those a little bit because I think that they are all super powerful. So we definitely have seen issues with those landing page URLs or just unique URLs. And we definitely have worked with advertisers where maybe even their company URL is pretty easy, but they create these super complicated URLs for their landing pages, or vice versa. Like maybe when they were naming the company, it's just was a really difficult name for people to either spell or understand. So I think that that is so super important. And if you do have a company with kind of a little bit of a strange name, you might consider creating a URL that is just, for that landing page that is just driving traffic. I know another experience I've had kind of along the same lines are with your promo code. I know I had an advertiser once, and I, of course, didn't know this until the end of the campaign, but they had made the promo code case sensitive. And they all had to be in uppercase, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, no wonder people aren't doing that." Like, nobody is going to go and put the promo code in uppercase, right? Like, just people just aren't gonna do those things, right? And so, like, you definitely need to make sure your promo codes aren't case sensitive. Now, I'm curious, you had mentioned maybe the podcaster choosing shows that don't represent their brand to the best or the highest extent. Do you find that advertisers maybe aren't doing a good enough job of investigating the shows they're advertising on? Or do you see that potentially maybe they're not going back to listen to the ad read and realize that like, oh, that ad read really wasn't done well? What mistakes are you seeing that those brands are making?
Yeah, I feel the discoverability of podcasts is a challenge. There are so many. And if you're a brand that is committed to a genre like news or comedy or parenting or whatever it might be, you could potentially miss other podcasts that do mirror the lifestyle. The hosts might mirror the lifestyle of the consumer that you're looking for. But there aren't a whole lot of resources to help advertisers sift through all of that. I mean, there are I take that back. There are a lot of resources to help advertisers sift through it, but there's so many podcasts. And I know that some of the exchanges have kind of changed their, and I guess, rules about when who they accept on an exchange and what size audience you have and how many downloads and impressions you can deliver and the like. But there's still so many podcasts out there. And the other difficult side of it is there are some really great podcasts out there and they might not be the best marketers or the best
Mm,
salespeople. They're not putting the right keywords or the right context in some of their descriptors. And so from an SEO perspective, they'll never be found. So it's that discoverability piece that if we had a better way to help brands learn more about the content that's out there, it would be easier for so many other publishers to be able to be attractive to different brands. It's just the nature of yeah, there's so 4 million now, I think.
yeah,
What I heard,
yeah,
it was
that's what
it was
I've heard too.
1 million a year ago, and now
Yeah.
it's 4 million. So how could you possibly sift through and find all of the awesome content if
Mhm.
you don't know it? So one of the things that we focus on is reaching out to brands that they might be a fan of our shows already based on social media, based on if they're in this market that is our home market and have some familiarity, that helps us tremendously. But I know that that's not a luxury that a lot of other podcasters have.
Yeah, for sure. So, in terms of, really thinking about creating podcast ad campaigns, there's so many pieces that are moving and changing, but really we know that podcast advertising is effective. The host read ads are effective. What are your predictions in terms of things on the horizon, things that maybe are going to be changing within this space?
Ooh, gosh, that's a great question. I feel like every time I think of something new, it's already happened by the time by the time I articulate it. I feel that we will start to see more social integration with podcast hosts. It
Mhm.
really is that next level. There aren't a lot of advertisers that are talking about that right now. And I don't know if it's because of the agency landscape and how influencer budgets are set, how digital audio budgets are set, or where that disconnect is. But I do feel that if there was a more holistic approach in that way and really maximizing your host beyond just the podcast, that there would be a whole other level of results that we would be able to measure and share and stake claim for, like you said, until other technology comes around. The other thing I would really love to see, or I'm hoping catches up, because I know it takes time to develop technology in new spaces, but to really be able to understand the individual listeners and the individual engagements that are happening and be able to drill down as to what the motivator was behind that. So, like you said, if they could click at a certain time so that we can capture that micro moment and know that, ooh, that was what they said that really moved this listener, then we can be more clever in our creative and acknowledge where we know what we know is motivating our listeners to do the actions that we're asking them to take. Our gut is what's driving that right now, but it would be really nice to have technology to help us see where that engagement spike happens.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, Kim, thank you so much for being on the program. It's been just great getting to know you and learning a little bit about your company, and always super excited to talk about podcast advertising. I think that you've given our audience a lot to think about in terms of creating successful campaigns. If people want to connect with you, where's a good place for them to find you?
The best place to find me is at Kim at pioneerpodcasting.com. Pioneer spelled Pioneare, podcasting.com. Nice play on words, but it's hard for us to be found sometimes. Or you can also go to our website and check out pioneerpodcasting.com as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. I really appreciate your podcast. Education is key. And so I thank you for being one of those fabulous educators.
Yes, yes, of course. And thank you for listening. I hope that this episode has given you some great nuggets of information when you are thinking about creating your next podcast campaign. If you're interested in learning more about podcast advertising, you can head on over to our website, truenativemedia.com, and download our podcast advertising guide. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.